My name is Juan Mario, and for many years I was a man of God. My path to this point was paved with the stones of faith, each one laid with a fervent belief in redemption and the inherent goodness of the human soul. I was a priest in a forgotten neighborhood of 1970s Mexico City, a place where dust and despair clung to everything, but where I saw light in the eyes of children and hope in the hearts of the faithful. My life was the parish, my shield was the gospel, and my mission was to serve. If my story touches you in any way, I ask you to subscribe to this channel so that my account is not lost to the silence. We want to reach 1,000 souls who still believe that justice, in one form or another, must prevail. Comment where you're listening from, so I know I'm not alone in this darkness. The parish of St. Cecilia was my sanctuary, a stone oasis in the middle of a desert of concrete and crime. The thick walls muffled the sound of distant sirens and street brawls, replacing them with the soft echo of prayers and the smell of incense and burnt candles. I moved through that sacred space as if it were an extension of my own body. Every wooden pew, every sun-stained glass window knew the weight of my steps and the sincerity of my prayers. Outside, the world was governed by fear, a web woven by the local cartel, which suffocated the community with extortion and violence. The police, led by the corrupt Captain Garza, were just another thread in that web, serving the criminals instead of the people they swore to protect. My faith was the armor I wore every day. I truly believed that forgiveness was the most powerful weapon against evil, that a word of comfort could heal more deeply than any physical wound. I would climb to the pulpit and preach about God's mercy to men and women whose lives were marked by its absence. I encouraged them to resist despair, to find strength in community, and to trust in the divine plan, even when the reality around us seemed a cruel mockery of any sacred order. That conviction, however, was a sandcastle, and I didn't know that the tide of violence was about to rise and wash it all away, leaving only the foundation of a fury I didn't even know I possessed. At my side, in this daily battle for the soul of the neighborhood, was Sister Elena. She was young, full of an energy that seemed inexhaustible, and she ran the small orphanage attached to the church with a mixture of sweetness and firmness that charmed everyone. To the children, she was a mother. To the community, a beacon of hope. To me, she was my right hand, the personification of the purity and courage I so admired. Elena did not fear the men who haunted our streets. She faced them with a serene gaze and an unshakable faith, believing that even the hardest heart could be touched by divine grace. Her presence was living proof of everything I preached, the confirmation that good could indeed flourish in the most arid places. Our conversations, usually over simple meals, in the sacristy were my refuge. We talked about the orphanage's struggles, about a parishioner's wavering faith, or about small victories like securing food donations for the neediest families. In her eyes, I saw the reflection of my own calling, but without the shadow of doubt that sometimes assailed mine. She was the certainty, and I was the search. I remember one afternoon she told me, "Juan, fear only has the power we give it. Our faith has to be greater." Little did she know, little did we know, that the evil surrounding us didn't care about our faith. It only demanded submission, and it was hungry. The presence of Ricardo El Carnicero Montes's cartel was like a cancer spreading slowly through the alleys. At first, it was just rumors, whispers from merchants forced to pay for protection. Then the violence became explicit. Bodies would appear at dawn, a macabre warning to anyone who dared to defy his power. The church was one of the few places he had not yet touched. Directly, perhaps out of a remnant of superstition, or because he considered us harmless. We were a symbol of a different authority, one not based on bullets and blood, but on hope. And for a man like El Carnicero, hope was a threat that eventually needed to be eradicated. I saw the anguish in the faces that came to confession. They were not just sins of lust or envy, but confessions of fear, of forced collaboration with the cartel, of silence bought by the safety of their families. I offered God's forgiveness, but I felt the helplessness of not being able to offer real protection. My words of comfort seemed empty in the face of the brutality that awaited them outside the church. A silent anger began to grow in me, a dissonance between the priest who preached turning the other cheek and the man who watched his flock be terrorized. I prayed. I asked God for a sign, for an intervention, but the heavens remained silent. The last time I saw Elena smile was on a sunny morning in the orphanage courtyard. She was surrounded by children, and the sunlight seemed to create a halo around her head. She looked up, met my gaze from a distance, and waved, a simple gesture, full of life and promise. That image was etched into my soul, a perfect photograph of all that was good and pure in our miserable world. It was the last moment of peace, the last breath of innocence before the tragedy that would redefine me. That night, evil knocked on our door, not with a whisper, but with a scream of agony that would echo forever in my heart, transforming a man of faith into the angel of vengeance the city would learn to fear. The sound that tore through the night was not of bells, but of a single siren approaching with a profane urgency. I was jolted from a light sleep by frantic pounding on the rectory door. It was Sophia, one of the older girls from the orphanage, her face awash in tears and terror. Her words stumbled out, a torrent of panic that my brain refused to process. "Father, it's Sister Elena. They hurt her." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I ran outside, and the scene I found was a nightmare painted in the colors of violence. The orphanage gate, always a symbol of refuge, was wide open like a screaming mouth. The news spread like wildfire through the community. The nun had been killed. The reason, whispered fearfully from door to door, was simple and brutal. She had refused to pay the protection demanded by El Carnicero. I arrived. At the scene, and the sight that awaited me broke something fundamental within me. Elena's small office, once a space of order and welcome, had been vandalized, transformed into a profane altar for her execution. Indifferent policemen circulated the perimeter, their dirty boots treading on the sacred ground where children played. I saw the chalk outline on the floor, an anonymous shape that did no justice to the light she radiated. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood, an odor that overpowered the familiar scent of chalk and paper from the orphanage. There, on that stained floor, lay not just the body of a nun, but the corpse of my faith in the natural order of things, in the divine justice I so often preached. Goodness had been punished with death. Driven by a cold fury I had never experienced, I went straight to the police station. I found Captain Garza leaning back in his chair, exuding the smell of cheap alcohol and cynicism. I demanded answers, justice, action. He looked at me with bored, glazed eyes, as if I were just another naive citizen complaining about the inevitable. "Father," he said, with an insulting calm, "these things happen. She should have paid. She didn't understand how the world works around here." Those words were like a punch to the gut. In that moment, I understood the complete and terrifying truth. The law was not a shield for the innocent, but a tool for the powerful. The police were not the solution. They were part of the disease, consuming our community. I left there with the certainty that we were alone. I returned to the church, but the sanctuary now felt like a tomb. I knelt before the altar, the silence echoing like an accusation. The large wooden crucifix hanging on the wall seemed to stare at me, the suffering Christ, an image not of redemption, but of passivity in the face of evil. I screamed in silence at the God I had served with such devotion. Where was he when Elena was murdered? Where was his divine wrath? My prayers turned into accusations. My faith disintegrated into ashes of rage and pain. I looked at my own hands, hands that had baptized children and blessed the dying, and for the first time I imagined them stained with blood. If God would not bring justice to this place, then I would. This was my decision, my new baptism, not in holy water, but in the fire of vengeance. That night, the priest Juan Mario died, and something else, darker and more determined, was born in his place. I realized that my position gave me a weapon no other man possessed, the secret of the confessional. The very monsters who terrorized my flock came to me seeking absolution for their lesser sins, not knowing they were handing over the keys to their kingdom of terror. My confessional would become my interrogation room, and the cassock my disguise. In that moment of decision, I was completely alone, a man at war with hell, with no God by my side. That is why, if you are hearing this, I ask you to subscribe. Knowing that my story is being heard, that my sacrifice might have some meaning, is what gives me the strength to continue telling it. My first step into darkness was taken inside the confessional. The smell of old wood and dust, which once brought me peace, now seemed to conspire with me. One of El Carnicero's henchmen, a young man named Mateo, came to confess, not for murder, but for some insignificant theft. In his arrogance, seeking to ease a shallow conscience, he began to boast of his importance, of how trustworthy he was. And then he gave me what I needed. He mentioned the name of a lookout, a man named Hector, who was on guard on the orphanage's street the night Elena was killed, complaining that the fool had abandoned his post early. I kept my voice calm, pastoral, granting him penance, while my mind transformed into a map of vengeance, with Hector as the first destination. The preparation was an unholy ritual. I didn't own a gun and wouldn't know how to use one. Instead, I went down to the church basement, a place of forgotten things, and found my weapon, a heavy, rusted crowbar used years before in a renovation. The weight of the iron in my hand felt alien, an antithesis to the light communion wafers I distributed. I returned to the sacristy and took my rosary, the same one Elena had given me. I wrapped the wooden beads tightly around my fist, the knots pressing into my skin. The silver crucifix hung down, cold against my fingers. Faith was no longer a shield to protect me from evil, but a reinforcement for the weapon I would use to fight it. I was ready to commit a mortal sin in the name of a saint. I found Hector in a dark alley behind a cantina, the air heavy with the smell of garbage and cheap tequila. My heart hammered against my ribs, a terrified war drum. I called his name, and when he turned, his eyes widened in confusion at the sight of a priest emerging from the shadows. The first blow was clumsy, a strike of pure fury that hit him in the shoulder. He screamed, and the ensuing fight was desperate and ugly. There was nothing cinematic or righteous about it. It was a brutal struggle, filled with grunts and the nauseating sound of breaking bone. When he finally fell, and silence returned, I stood panting over his still body. The priest in me screamed in horror, but the man driven by vengeance had completed his baptism by fire. I returned to the church like a ghost, another man's blood under my fingernails. In the small sacristy sink, I tried to wash away the stain, but it was as if it had seeped into my skin, into my soul. The water running down the drain seemed murky with sin. I looked at my reflection in a piece of broken mirror and did not recognize myself. The eyes staring back were those of a predator, haunted and empty. I tried to pray the Lord's Prayer, but the words died in my throat, a poison of hypocrisy. How could I ask for forgiveness when I felt no remorse, only a dark and terrible satisfaction? In that moment, I understood the depth of my fall. I had silenced a voice of evil, but I had also silenced the voice of God within me. The news of Hector's death spread quickly. The body, found with a rosary wrapped around his broken hand, generated a wave of whispers and speculation. No one mourned the loss of a known cartel henchman, but the method intrigued everyone. It was not a typical gangland settling of scores. It had a different quality, almost ritualistic. They began to speak of a vigilante, some even calling him the Angel of Vengeance, a divine force cleaning the streets that the police refused to patrol. I overheard these conversations in the market after Mass, and a chill ran down my spine. I was no angel. I was a broken man committing monstrous acts. Yet the seed of a legend had been planted, and I, its anonymous creator, would water it with more blood. It was then that Detective Valdez entered the picture. He was different from the rest of the police force, older, with a weary gaze that saw everything but had not yet become cynical. He examined Hector's body with a meticulous attention that unsettled me. Valdez immediately dismissed the gang war theory. "This is personal," I heard him tell one of his subordinates. "This is anger. This is righteous fury." He found a wooden fragment from the rosary bead and carefully bagged it. I felt his gaze sweep the crowd, as if he could sniff out the culprit. In that moment, I knew El Carnicero was not my only hunter. There was a good man looking for me too, and I didn't know which one I feared more. While the legend of the angel grew, suspicion sprouted in an unexpected place. Sophia, still carrying the pain of Elena's loss like a shadow, began to watch me. She saw the exhaustion on my face, but also something more, a hardness that wasn't there before. My sermons, once focused on mercy, now contained passages about God's wrath and the punishment of sinners. One day, she held my arm after Mass. "Father, are you all right? You seem so distant and so angry." Her words were of genuine concern, but her eyes were filled with a question she dared not ask. I reassured her with soft lies, but as I walked away, I felt the weight of her innocence. She was a mirror of everything I was betraying. I decided to use the pulpit not just to preach, but to hunt. The following Sunday, I delivered a sermon on Judas, on betrayal, and the price the soul pays for blood money. I looked directly at the faces I knew belonged to the cartel, men who came to Mass out of habit or to keep up appearances. My words were for them, a veiled warning wrapped in scripture. "God sees everything," I said, my voice echoing in the silent church, "and his patience has a limit. The day of reckoning always comes, whether in this life or the next." I saw some of them shift uncomfortably in their seats. The message had been delivered. The angel of vengeance now spoke through the priest. With information gleaned from another confession, I identified my next target, a mid-level manager responsible for extortion in the market area. This time, I was more careful. I spent 2 days observing his routine, learning his paths, his vices. The blind rage of the first time gave way to a cold precision. I was no longer an amateur driven by grief. I was becoming a hunter, methodical and patient. The transformation frightened me, but the need to continue was stronger. Every step I took down this dark path was a step away from Juan Mario, the sea priest, and a step toward the shadow I needed to be to protect my flock. The confrontation happened on a rooftop, under the cloak of a starless night. It was quick, brutal, and silent. I used the element of surprise, the environment to my advantage. He barely had time to react. This time, there was no clumsy struggle. It was an execution. Before I left, I picked up a piece of charcoal from the debris and drew a crude cross on the wall above the body. It was a signature, a mark so everyone would know this was no ordinary crime. It was an act of the angel. As I descended to the silent streets, I didn't feel the nausea of the first time, but a cold emptiness. With every life I took, a part of my own humanity was extinguished. The news of the second death, marked with the cross, reached Ricardo El Carnicero and enraged him. This was no longer about petty henchmen being eliminated. It was a direct challenge to his authority, an affront to his aura of invincibility. He couldn't conceive that someone from the neighborhood would have the courage to fight back. To him, sheep do not attack the wolf. Furious, he summoned his men and offered a generous bounty for the head of the angel. The hunt became official. He also began to look more closely at the one institution that still preached spiritual rebellion, my church. Suddenly, my sanctuary had become the center of a battlefield. For Detective Valdez, the cross on the wall was the missing piece. Now he had a pattern, a modus operandi. He connected the manager's death to Hector's, confirming his suspicions of a single vigilante. His investigation, logical and methodical, led him to the epicenter of both crimes and the growing legend, the parish of St. Cecilia. He knew the angel had to be someone from within, someone with intimate knowledge of the community and a powerful motive. He began to investigate the churchgoers, to interview people, to close in on me. I could feel his presence circling, a patient and intelligent predator on my trail. It was during this period that my internal transformation was completed. Looking at the children playing in the church courtyard, the same courtyard where Elena last smiled, I had a dark epiphany. My mission was no longer just about avenging her death. It was about them. It was about ensuring they could grow up without the fear that paralyzed their parents. I had become their guardian, a shepherd who used the staff not to guide, but to strike down the wolves. I realized I could no longer go back. I had become something different, a necessary sacrifice. If you understand the weight of this journey, please show your support and subscribe. Every subscription is a reminder that I am not completely lost in the shadows. The pressure mounted, and with it the mistakes. On a rainy night while stalking another target, I was surprised by a police patrol. It wasn't Valdez's team, just two corrupt officers making their rounds. The chase was desperate, a blur of slippery alleys and jumps over walls. I used my knowledge of the neighborhood, every shortcut and hiding place I had learned over the years, to lose them. I escaped by a hair's breadth, my heart pounding out of control, my body covered in mud and scratches. The experience was a stark warning. I was not invincible. I was just one man, alone, hunted by both sides of the law. At any moment, my luck could run out. Maintaining the double life was destroying me. By day, I was Father Juan Mario, conducting Mass, hearing confessions, offering counsel. But my words sounded hollow. My blessings felt like a sham. Exhaustion carved deep lines into my face. By night, I was a shadow, moving through the streets with a deadly purpose. The transition between the two roles became increasingly difficult. One morning, during communion, I noticed a dark bruise on my hand as I offered the host to an elderly woman. She smiled gently, oblivious to the fact that the hand offering her salvation was the same one that had taken lives the night before. The hypocrisy was consuming me. The visit from Detective Valdez was inevitable. He didn't come with a warrant, but under the pretext of offering condolences for Sister Elena and discussing the church's security. We sat in my office, the same one where Elena and I used to talk. The tension was almost unbearable. He was polite, but his eyes were like scalpels, dissecting my every word, my every gesture. He spoke about justice, about how the law, however flawed, is the only thing that separates us from chaos. I responded with a priest's platitudes, talking about faith and God's justice. It was a dangerous game of verbal chess, and I knew one wrong move could checkmate me. Frustrated by his inability to find the angel, El Carnicero decided to send a clear message. He targeted Mr. Rojas, the elderly baker whose shop was across from the church. Rojas was a good man who often donated bread to the orphanage and spoke openly of his admiration for the church's work. Carnicero's men didn't kill him. They beat him brutally and burned down his bakery, leaving him alive to serve as an example. The community was terrified. The message was clear. Anyone who supported the church or felt inspired by this new savior would become a target. The war had come to the doorstep of the innocent. The sight of Mr. Rojas, his face swollen and his spirit broken, filled me with an overwhelming guilt. That man was suffering because of me. My secret war was exposing the very people I had sworn to protect. That night, doubt assaulted me more fiercely than ever. Should I stop? Give up this crusade and allow evil to win, to spare more suffering? Kneeling in the empty church, I looked at the statue of the Archangel Michael defeating the devil. The answer came to me not as a divine voice, but as a cold, hard conviction. To retreat now would be to dishonor Elena's sacrifice and Rojas's pain. I would not stop. I would go deeper. I would rip the evil out by its roots. The opportunity came in the form of a trembling confession. One of the men involved in the bakery fire, consumed by guilt, came to me. Amidst sobs, he not only confessed his crime, but revealed something crucial. El Carnicero was planning a major drug shipment, a deal the leader himself would personally oversee at an abandoned warehouse near the train tracks. This was it, the chance to bypass the pawns and strike at the heart of the command. In that moment, I made the decision. That would seal my fate. I wouldn't hunt another henchman. I would intercept that shipment. I would deal a blow that would cripple the organization and bring me face to face with the men closest to the devil himself. My preparation this time was different. It was no longer about a crowbar and the darkness. It was about strategy. I spent a full day observing the warehouse from a distance, mapping the entrances, the escape routes, the number of guards. I didn't have an army, so I would have to use the environment as my weapon. I planned to create a diversion, to use the confusing layout of the place to separate and isolate the targets. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was planning a battle. The priest who quoted scripture now drew maps of attack in the dust of the sacristy floor, preparing for a war of his own making. On the night I prepared for the attack, Sophia sealed her own fate. Worried by my increasingly erratic behavior, she decided to follow me, keeping a safe distance. She saw me leave the church, not in my cassock, but in dark, worn-out clothes. She watched me move through the shadows with an agility and purpose that did not belong to a priest. The shock on her face, briefly illuminated by a distant streetlight, was one of pure disbelief. Then something fell from my pocket as I climbed a wall. After I disappeared, she approached and picked up the object. It was my rosary, the one Elena gave me, but one of the wooden beads was chipped, and the small silver cross was stained with something dark and dry. The raid on the warehouse was controlled chaos. I created a diversion by setting a pile of trash on fire at one end of the complex, drawing the attention of most of the guards. In the confusion, I entered from the opposite side. I used the noise and shadows to my advantage, moving like a phantom. The confrontation was a series of swift, brutal clashes amidst crates and rusted machinery. I managed to disable several men and destroy a significant portion of the shipment before they could regroup. In the midst of the pandemonium, I managed to corner one of El Carnicero's top lieutenants, a man named Alvarez. Carnicero himself, however, was nowhere to be seen. I dragged the wounded and terrified Alvarez away from the chaos, taking him to the one place I knew would be my domain, the forgotten catacombs beneath the church. There, in the damp, sepulchral silence, the real battle began. It was not a battle of fists, but of souls. I used everything I was, a priest's knowledge of sin, guilt, and the fear of damnation and the cold threat of a killer. I spoke to him of hell, not as a theological possibility, but as a place I would personally send him. I pressed him, exploiting his weaknesses, his greed, his fear of his own boss, and finally, he broke. With a trembling voice, Alvarez revealed El Carnicero's final plan. Humiliated by the angel's audacity and the damage to his operation, he had decided to burn out the very root of the rebellion. He no longer just wanted to kill me. He wanted to destroy the symbol of hope I represented. The plan was to lock the church doors during midnight mass, the most attended of the year, and set fire to the building with the entire community inside. It would be a massacre, an act of terror so absolute that no one would ever dare defy him again. The climax would not be in a dark warehouse, but on the holy ground of my own home. With the revelation weighing on me like a shroud, I walked through the nave of my church, It was late at night, and the only sound was the crackling of votive candles. I looked at the empty pews, where my parishioners would sit in a few hours. I saw Sophia's face in my mind, that of Mr. Rojas, of the children from the orphanage. Every sin I had committed, every piece of my soul I had sacrificed had been for them. The war was no longer about Elena or about me. It was about them. El Carnicero wanted to destroy the soul of the community, and I was the only thing standing in his way. I was no longer an angel of vengeance. I was the last line of defense, and I would not fail. The midnight mass began under a shroud of foreboding. The church was fuller than ever, the heat from the bodies and hundreds of candles creating a dense, almost suffocating atmosphere. I stood at the altar, speaking the sacred words of the ritual, but my mind and soul were elsewhere. My eyes scanned the congregation, not for devotion, but for threats. Every creak of the doors, every cough was a potential signal. Then a subtle but definitive sound broke the spell, the heavy thud of iron bolts being slid shut from the outside. A murmur of confusion began to spread, and it was soon followed by a sharp chemical odor seeping under the doors. Gasoline. The panic, once a whisper, was about to become a deafening scream. The first flash of fire that licked the base of the ancient wooden doors was like a death sentence. Screams erupted, the sanctity of the moment shattered into 1,000 pieces of terror. Thick black smoke began to roll into the nave, a gaseous demon that choked and blinded. The congregation, once a body united in prayer, became a mass of terrified individuals, running in every direction. Amidst the chaos, a cold clarity took hold of me. I climbed the pulpit steps, and my voice, amplified by the church's acoustics, rang out above the panic. They were not words of comfort, but commands. Be calm. Follow me. There is a way out through the sacristy. Quickly, help each other. I had spent the previous afternoon clearing a sealed passage in the catacombs, an escape route that was now their only hope. As I pushed the last of the people, including a terrified Sophia, to the safety of the passage, a silhouette emerged from the flames, now consuming a side entrance. It was Ricardo El Carnicero Montes. He wasn't there to die. He was there to host this hell. In his hand, he held a crowbar, the same kind of tool I had used, and on his face was a smile of sadistic ecstasy. The fire danced in his eyes as he blocked my path. "Nowhere to run, Father," he sneered, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "It seems God is busy tonight. Now it's just you and me in the middle of your burning house. The final battle would not be in the dark streets, but here, at the altar of my dying faith. The confrontation was a profane dance in the midst of hell. We fought with the fury of two men who had nothing left to lose, centuries old. Wooden pews, now ablaze, became obstacles and weapons. The air was so hot it burned the lungs with every breath. We crashed against the main altar, sending the great silver crucifix swinging wildly above us. The sound of our blows mingled with the crackling of wood and the groaning of the collapsing roof. He was stronger, but I was driven by a fury that transcended physical strength. Every blow I landed was for Elena, for Mr. Rojas, for the terrified children. I was not fighting for my life. I was fighting for the soul of my community. "Look at you, you hypocrite!" El Carnicero shouted as he pressed me against the baptismal font, the water now simmering from the heat. "You preach forgiveness and peace, but you're a killer, just like me. You love the violence as much as I do." His words were poison, meant to break my spirit, but in the middle of that inferno, I saw the truth. "No," I gasped, shoving him back. "You kill for power, for greed. You are the void, the absence of everything. I became a monster to fight monsters like you." The fire revealed our true essences. He, a demon reveling in destruction. I, a fallen angel fighting to protect what remained of paradise. With a final burst of adrenaline, I managed to disarm him. The crowbar fell with a dull thud. A well-placed blow brought him to the floor, right in the center of the nave, as pieces of the flaming ceiling rained down around us. He was at my feet, defeated, spitting blood and curses. I picked up a large piece of a broken timber, its end sharpened like a spear. The image of Elena, smiling in the sun, flashed in my mind, followed by the image of her lifeless body. Vengeance was there, within my grasp. One blow, a single blow, and it would all be over. The bloody justice my soul had screamed for months was a second away. My entire being yearned for that moment of final release. The ceiling above us gave a terrible groan, the sound of the church's imminent death. El Carnicero laughed, a gurgling sound. "Do it, Father. Show God who you really are." And it was then that the choice became clear. To kill him here would make me exactly what he said I was. It would be an act to satisfy my own pain, not to serve justice. Avenging Elena didn't mean becoming her opposite, but honoring what she stood for, mercy, the belief that even the darkest soul has a chance. I lowered the timber. Instead of impaling him, I swung the flat side into his head with enough force to plunge him into unconsciousness. I would let him live, not for God's forgiveness, but for the justice of men, however imperfect it might be. I dragged El Carnicero's limp body out of the burning church, the infernal heat at my back. The night air, cool and clean, was a shock to my smoke-filled lungs. I left him slumped on the stone steps, an unholy trophy at the entrance of what had been my sanctuary. The approaching sirens were my cue to leave. There was no place for me in the scene that would follow, with its flashing lights, questions, and the bureaucratic justice of men. My part was done. As the first police cars rounded the corner, I melted into the shadows of the alleys, disappearing like a phantom. From a safe distance, I watched Detective Valdez arrive to find the city's most wanted criminal delivered to him amidst the rubble of a church and a life that were no longer mine. 2 days later, I arranged a meeting with Valdez on a deserted bridge at dawn. The air was cold and mist hovered over the river below. I wasn't wearing my cassock. I was just a man in worn clothes, with burns on my hands and ashes in my soul. I handed him a thick folder. Inside was El Carnicero's ledger, detailing every bribe payment, every operation, and a detailed confession I had extracted from the Lieutenant Alvarez, implicating dozens of officials, including Captain Garza. Valdez didn't ask me how I got it. He didn't need to. He looked at me, the priest he had suspected, and he saw the angel he had hunted, the silent. Understanding between us was heavier than any formal confession. The truth was there between us. Valdez leafed through the documents under the dim light of a lamppost, then closed the folder. For a long moment, he just looked at me, his face a mask of conflict. He was a man of the law, and I was living proof of its failure. But he was also a just man. "The law would demand your arrest," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "But justice sometimes has a different face. The city doesn't need a martyred priest. It needs its freedom." He took the folder and turned away. "Disappear, Father. Let the legend be all that's left of you." It was an act of absolution that no priest could give me, a recognition that to cure a terminal disease, sometimes you must use a forbidden medicine. Months passed. From the distant hill where I took refuge, I watched the neighborhood begin to bloom again. Led by a stronger, wiser Sophia, the community members rebuilt the church, stone by stone. It was no longer a place of fear, but a monument to their own resilience. My story ends here, in the shadows, watching the peace that my sin bought. If my sacrifice meant something to you, if you believe that a soul can fight against the darkness, even if it gets lost in it, please subscribe. Help keep this story alive as a testament that even in the longest night, hope can be rebuilt brick by brick, and faith, even when lost by one, can be rediscovered by many. The final image I carry with me is of the afternoon sun hitting the church's new stained glass windows. A bell, rescued from the rubble and polished, tolls, its sound clear and full of promise echoing through the valley. The children, including Elena's orphans, run and play in the square, their laughter the most sacred music I have ever heard. They were safe. My flock was safe. With one last look at the world I saved but can never again belong to, I turned and walked toward the horizon. A pilgrim with no destination, condemned to a life of solitary penance. I lost my salvation, but I gave them theirs, and in the end, perhaps that was the closest thing to a miracle that a man like me could ever perform.